We have a lot of ground to cover here, and we're going to talk about the United Nations. Here's the UN headquarters, built on land donated by surprise by the Rockefellers, right? Right there in New York City, very expensive property, as you could imagine. The United Nations is intending to do away with nationhood, but where did nationhood begin? Anybody who's a student of the Scripture, especially the Old Testament, would know that the beginning of nationhood started at a place called the Tower of Babel. These people were anxious to build a world government. They were even going to approach with their structure all the way up to the heavens, but it turned out that God intervened and He confused the tongues, and the project was scrapped. And what happened is the people who could speak with each other after the confusion of the tongues went off and formed a nation. And others went and formed a nation over here because they could only speak to a portion of the people there. And actually, nationhood began at the Tower of Babel, and it was God's doing. And if God wanted nationhood, then we don't want a United Nations. That's one good reason, but there are many, many more. This is a drawing done by a Belgian in the 1600s, and it's been adopted and refined a little bit by the European Union. They actually have a poster that they put out depicting the Tower of Babel, and that tells you something about the European Union, doesn't it? The goal is world government. Now, you can go back in history to 1776 and the creation of the Illuminati by Adam Weishaupt. His goal was world government. He was succeeded by Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian firebrand. He formed the Carbonari. He formed young Italy and then young Germany, young France, young Spain, young America. There was a branch of the Carbonari in our country called Young America. Right? Well, Mazzini then went to England and teamed up with Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, of course, communism and socialism, everybody's heard of Karl Marx. And what was his goal? World government, again. And then we see a man named Edward Mandell House. He came along as Woodrow Wilson's top assistant, and he had written a book called Philip Drew Administrator, wherein he called for world government, right? Among other things, right? Here's the book that House wrote, Philip Drew Administrator. Of, I think, important significance is the fact that the dedicatory quote in this book is from Giuseppe Mazzini. Now, I would guess that most of you in the audience have never heard of Giuseppe Mazzini, but Edward Mandell House had heard of him and honored him by choosing a statement that he had made as the dedicatory quote in the book Philip Drew Administrator, which was written in 1912, by the way. Edward Mandell House saw socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. He said that in his own book. He despised the U.S. Constitution. He advocated the income tax and the Federal Reserve. He proposed world government, and he launched the Council on Foreign Relations. The launching of the Council on Foreign Relations occurred when the U.S. Senate in 1919 said no to America joining the League of Nations. And we have to be very grateful for the stalwart senators who fought against the League of Nations way back in 1919. If they had succeeded in creating the U.S. membership in the League of Nations, it's kind of frightening to think of what would have happened. Right? But it's also safe to say that because of the failure of the League of Nations to attract the United States, that there had to be another war, and the other war came, as we know, in World War II, and at the end of that, we joined the new United Nations. All right. In 1919, the Senate vote to join the League of Nations, they debated the matter for 9 months, and they ended up saying no. Now keep that in mind. 9 months, no. All right, we see a crisis. We've all heard the phrase of Rahm Emanuel saying, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Right? And if you don't have a crisis occur, you create one. Right? So a crisis occurred on December 7th of 1941. We all know that, Pearl Harbor. A crisis was a terrible thing to waste, so the crisis led to World War II. World War II started when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. We declared war on Japan, and Germany and Italy declared war on us. That's not well known. They had a tripartite agreement that an attack on one would be considered an attack on the other. And so when we declared war on Japan, immediately Germany and Italy declared war on us. And so now we were at war in two continents at the same time. And of course, the US government officials said that we were surprised. We weren't surprised at all. Now, within months of Pearl Harbor, discussions about the formation of the United Nations began. The long planning began within about 6 weeks of the event at Pearl Harbor. So we see in 1942, 26 nations issue a formal declaration of the United Nations. That's when they first started using the term. 1943, the Allied nations meet, US, UK, USSR, China, and agree to form a world government. 1944, the famous Dumbarton Oaks Conference. Dumbarton Oaks is the greatest state in Washington, D.C., and it issued the initial draft of the UN Charter. 1945, the San Francisco Conference, 50 nations attended, and they produced the final UN Charter. And this was done before the war in the Pacific had ended. The Secretary General of the UN Founding Conference is named Alger Hiss. And of course, he was later shown to have been a communist all the time. The chief authors of the UN Charter, two men, Andrei Gromyko from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, who was an open communist, and Alger Hiss from the United States, a secret communist. Does the United Nations Charter follow along communist designs? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious. The U.S. delegation at the UN founding, there were secret communists. In addition to Hiss, there were 16 others who were later shown to have been communists all the time. And there were 43 members of the U.S. delegation who were Council on Foreign Relations members, either then or soon after. One of them being Nelson Rockefeller, by the way. He was very prominent in this. So in 1945, the Senate was presented with the Charter of the United Nations, and they debated the matter for 6 days, and they approved it by a vote of 89-2. Now, remember what I said before about the League of Nations was debated for 9 months? No. 6 days? Yes. Right? Now, the two senators who voted for us to stay out of the UN refused to sign the charter. One was William Langer from North Dakota. Another was Henrik Shipstead from Minnesota. There was another senator from California named Hiram Johnson who would have voted against the UN, but he was ill in a hospital. He died soon after, so they really would have been 3 if he had been able to vote. I'm old enough to remember that period, and I can remember even my own father, who was a good patriot. He was saying, well, we got to do something new. We got to try something different. Here we've had World War I and we've had World War II in my lifetime, a space of only 25 years separating them. And so obviously something new has to be tried. And that's the way it was sold. It was sold to the American public. It was sold to the U.S. senators. Of course, there were some senators who were determined, very, very pro-UN because they knew it was so harmful and they wanted that. But that's the attitude of the American people at the time, and so we are now in the United Nations. Now, something else needs to be said, and that is that the United Nations vote at the Senate was considered a treaty, and so they had to have 2/3 of the Senate to pass it. Well, a treaty is an agreement between two sovereign entities, and so the agreement to join the United Nations could not be a treaty, because the United Nations was not a sovereign entity. It wasn't then, it is not now, it never has been. It wants to be. And so it was fraud right from the beginning. even as good a senator as Robert Taft of Ohio, who was greatly revered by our founder, Robert Welch, and anybody who was a stalwart patriot back in that period thought highly of Senator Taft from Ohio. Even he voted for it, and he later regretted it and said the UN is a trap, let's go it alone. Right? And he worked very hard to get others to begin to realize that they'd been suckered, and he wasn't very successful. Now here's the Charter of the United Nations. It's not a very big document. In fact, a pamphlet containing the entire Charter of the United Nations is smaller than the booklet that we put out with the Constitution and the Declaration. It's not a very large document at all. But by ratifying the UN Charter, the U.S. Senate put the U.S. into the world body. So let's take a look at the Charter. Article 1, the word peace appears 6 times. And so the UN has been called a peace organization. You've heard that, right? But Article 2 discusses application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. This means war. So they say they're a peace organization in Article 1, and then they put together the procedures for the United Nations to conduct war in Article 2. And Article 2 said enforcement measures under Chapter 7. All right, so what's Chapter 7 say in the UN Charter? It authorizes demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the United Nations. Is that not war? Right? But it's a peace organization, remember that, right? Now, here's Article 25 of the United Nations Charter. Consider that you're a senator, 1945, you're asked to join with others, approve entry of the United States into this new organization by approving the Charter of the United Nations. All right? Would you, as a United States senator, have voted for this? The members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. How many of you senators out there would have accepted that? Right? 89 did. 89 did. I dare say there were some senators who never read the Charter. Right? I dare say that there were some who were very, very anxious to have it approved because they were internationalists, pro-communists at the time. But this is incredible. This trumps the Constitution, doesn't it? If the Security Council says, here's something that has to be done, and we're a member of the UN, we have to go ahead and follow what they've said. And you know what? The United States does follow every Security Council resolution. Article 43, all members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including the rites of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Right? What a fraud. What a fraud, right? But there it is. You know? So all members of the United Nations, we are now a member of the United Nations. We sanctified the treaty. We're now part of this organization. And we agree in Article 43 that all members undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces. Right? Well, then we see what happened about making forces available to the United Nations. In December of 1945, recall that the Charter was approved in July, the U.S. Congress passed the United Nations Participation Act. And there are 2 parts to the United Nations Participation Act. The first part says the President must have the approval of Congress to supply troops for a UN standing army. The UN has always wanted its own army. It never has had its own army. They've always had to go to different countries and form coalitions, right? And so that part of the United Nations Participation Act has never been implemented because they've never gone to the Congress and asked for the United States to send troops to a standing army for the UN. But Part 2 of the United Nations Participation Act is very important. It says the President shall not be deemed to require the authorization of Congress to send troops to enforce Security Council resolutions. Right? So the U.S. Congress gave up the power to control whether or not our troops would go to Korea, to Vietnam, to Somalia, to Haiti, to wherever. They gave it up, and they gave it to the president with the United Nations Participation Act in December of 1945. The vote in the House was 344 to 15. Only 15 voted against this. One of the great ones who was a strong opponent was a female congressman from Illinois named Jessie Sumner. And she spoke out and nailed it, but nobody listened, or very few. Right? And then the Senate approved it by voice vote, and it's totally unconstitutional. We're certainly aware of that. It never should have passed. Now, we all know, at least those of us in the John Birch Society and maybe others who have decided to take a good hard look at us, that there is a bill in Congress to get us out of the United Nations. It's Ron Paul's bill, H.R. 1146. And the first item, it's only two or three pages, first item is to repeal the United Nations Participation Act. Right? It's comforting to know that there are some men in Congress, some in Congress, who appreciate what this particular piece of legislation means. Right? Here's Robert Taft. I mentioned he said only a couple of years after he had voted for the UN, he said, the UN has become a trap, let's go it alone. Now, in 1949, the U.S. Senate was asked to enter the United States into a regional organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And Secretary of State Dean Acheson, he said, NATO is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. He told that to the U.S. Senate, and so the U.S. Senate voted to put us into NATO. NATO is a regional arrangement. Articles 52, 53, and 4 in the UN Charter are the authorization for NATO and SEATO. It says in the Charter, Security Council shall utilize such regional arrangements for enforcement action under its authority. And the Security Council shall be kept fully informed of activities. SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, it's under that we went into Vietnam. All right, the Korean War started June 1950. North Korea invaded South Korea. The UN Security Council, all member states send forces, right? So how many member states sent forces to fight in Korea? Well, there were a small contingent from Canada, a small contingent from Turkey, a small contingent here. But of course, the bulk of it was U.S. U.S. supplied the troops. There was no declaration of war. Some astute people went to President Truman and said, where are you getting the authority to send troops into a conflict in Korea? And he said, we're not at war, this is a police action. And then he said this. He said, if I can send troops to NATO, which he had already done after the 1949 vote in the Senate, I can send troops to Korea. Well, Robert Taft tried to stop him, several other senators, but they didn't get very far. And during the Korean War, UN flags were flying during the police action. I know some veterans from the Korean War who came back and said they remember seeing those flags flying and they wanted to tear them down and throw them away, but they couldn't. And the state of war in Korea still exists 50 years later. It has never been settled. There has never been a formal armistice and never been a cessation. We still maintain 40,000 troops in South Korea, supposedly to defend South Korea against an invasion of the North. If it does happen, shouldn't South Korea take care of their own problem? South Korea is now an economic power. Let them defend themselves. Right? But that's not in the minds of the people that are running our government. Right? SEATO was another regional arrangement under Articles 52, 3, and 4 of the UN Charter. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson was asked, what is the authority for our troops in Vietnam? We are in Vietnam because the United States and our allies are committed by the SEATO Treaty to act to meet the common danger of aggression in Southeast Asia. So the authorization to go into Vietnam was under the UN. The UN had passed a Security Council resolution, and the United States obeyed. Desert Storm, 1991. President George H.W. Bush. Why are we going into Desert Storm? Here's what he said. The Gulf crisis has to do with a new world order. And that world order is only going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the United Nations proves to be effective. Was his goal to save Kuwait? No, his goal was to enhance the newly activated peacekeeping function of the United Nations. He said that. Well, now, the War of Desert Storm, that was the first into Iraq, 1991, and it went because Saddam Hussein had laid claim to Kuwait. He said it was the 19th province of my country, and I'm taking it back. Right? So we ended up saying, no, you can't do that, and enhance the UN and all this other stuff. But as soon as they got Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait, the war stopped. The war stopped suddenly, and a lot of people were saying, well, why didn't they go all the way on to Baghdad and get Saddam, save ourselves trouble down the road or whatever? Why did? Well, the war stopped suddenly because the UN Security Council authorized only forcing Iraq's forces out of Kuwait. Does the United States obey the United Nations Security Council resolutions? There's a good example. Okay, now we had a very interesting thing happen here. In October of 2002, you may recall that the second war against Iraq began in March of 2003. So this is 6 months before, when the war drums were being beaten and the attitude was being created, we got to go in Saddam Hussein, he's got weapons of mass destruction, and on and on and on. So Ron Paul was a member of the International Relations Committee. It used to be Foreign Affairs Committee, and again it's Foreign Affairs Committee, but then it was called International Relations. He stood up, Mr. Chairman, 45 members from both political parties. I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But he said, but I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. Good for you, Ron. Well, the chairman of the committee, of course, here's the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 says, Congress shall have power to declare war. Does anybody else have power to declare war? No. And Congress, last time they declared war was on December 8th of 1941 against Japan. So what happened? Well, Henry Hyde was the chairman of the committee. Here's his response to Ron Paul. There are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. There are things no longer relevant to a modern society. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic, it isn't done anymore. This guy is supposed to be a good student of the Constitution. He's the chairman of a very powerful committee in the U.S. Congress, and he's completely disdainful about the United States Constitution. So let's look at the wars after World War II. Korean War, obvious UN control. Vietnam War under SEATO. Desert Storm, authorized by the Security Council. Iraq, 2003, and we don't know when it'll end, authorized by the Security Council. Afghanistan is now under NATO. Libya is under NATO. What's next? How about Syria? Why not? What the heck? We've just focused here on the military aspect of the United Nations. Now here is a United Nations organizational chart. How do you get one of these? You go to the United Nations in New York City and they hand them out. I did it. I've gone into the belly of the beast. And I came out with this. Right? I studied this, and I saw that the United Nations' very own organizational chart said that there will be UN involvement in the following categories of life: education, population, children, women, environment, trade, finance, health, agriculture, labor, military, science, culture, atomic power, telecommunications, aviation, industrial development, narcotics, refugees, property rights, and I didn't even finish. It's all on their own organizational chart. Now, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights came out in 1948, and this is generally looked upon as a wonderful document. It's all about freedom for you and all the different kinds of freedom that you want and so on. One of the leaders of the drive for that was a woman named Eleanor Roosevelt, who on her own initiative had joined over 100 Communist Front organizations, even as the wife of the President of the United States. So what do we see there? Well, we see that Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, in the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. Now, when you go back to the Declaration of Independence that talks about God-given rights, and it doesn't have anything about limitations on law. You go to the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution, and it doesn't have an exception. It says Congress shall not. Right? Shall not, shall not, shall not, shall not. And I always love to say, all the way up to the marvelous 10th Amendment that says, if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. Right? Right? So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is totally subversive. It says these rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. But there's the UN versus the Bill of Rights. The United Nations says rights are granted but subject to limitations. Our Bill of Rights says rights are God-given and Congress shall make no law. Could it be different? No. No, it couldn't be different. Right? Well then, later on, they came out with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This was 1966. And the same kind of verbiage, recognizing that these rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. No, they don't. The rights derive from God Almighty, which is what our founders said. Men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. I want you to keep that in mind all the time and realize that if you're a teacher in a government school and you pronounce that, you may be in jeopardy. Right? And so most of them don't pronounce it anymore. Right? Now the other underlined part that I have here is realizing that the individual, having duties to other individuals and to the community to which he belongs, is under a responsibility to strive for the promotion and observance of the rights recognized in the present covenant, right? Well, that's all just verbiage. Again, United Nations, rights are granted but subject to limitations. Bill of Rights, rights are God-given and Congress shall make no law. Now we have to talk about Agenda 21. This is a UN project. It was conceived in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, where there were 35,000 delegates. Right? It's not generally known what's the significance of the number 21, Agenda 21. Well, the significance of that is they intended that it would be fully implemented in the 21st century. So they put it together in 1992, knowing that it would take a little bit of a while to get this thing underway, and it is now underway. And what it amounts to is the piecemeal takeover of cities, towns, and counties. Right? Not states, not even regions, but down at the local level. The document itself says that it applies to every person on earth. It masquerades under such terms as sustainable development, climate change, smart growth. Maybe you've seen a bumper sticker that says, think globally, act locally. Right? That's all part of this. Right? Well, Agenda 21 is a program to help solve environmental problems, most of which don't exist. And it's very, very devious and serious attack on personal freedom. And it's now an upfront agenda of the John Birch Society. We intend to be very, very upfront in fighting against this. Okay, now let's try and wind up this little oration here. We'll make a few conclusions. And the first is that the United Nations is not taking over our country. What's happening is the United States is being delivered to the United Nations. It's a whole different way of looking at it, isn't it? Right? The enemy is not Ban Ki-moon down in New York City, the Secretary General of the UN. The enemy is not our ambassador to the United Nations, whoever that might be. It's a female right now. The enemy is our own leadership that is working very, very diligently to deliver our country to the United Nations. And that realization has to be made, and it has to be spoken by folks like you all across the country. All right, conclusion number 2, membership in the United Nations is completely incompatible with maintaining the independence of the United States and the freedom of the American people. Right? It's completely incompatible. There are people who say, well, what we should do is we should cut back on our donations to the United Nations. No, no. Or we should send a different delegate to the United Nations. No. So what to do? Should we reform the United Nations? No. One does not reform cancer. One roots it out, right? And whatever other disease you might have, you don't reform it. You get rid of it. And so what to do? Find a friendlier Secretary General? Forget it. All previous sec-gens of the UN have been socialists, and that's the UN's choice. I consider socialism more deadly than communism. If a communist takes control of a country, he hasn't destroyed the resistance. And therefore he needs the KGB, he needs the gulags, he needs these other things that communist nations have always been very happy to create. But go to the socialists and what do you see? You see, the socialists get you to vote yourself into the condition which is the same condition as communism, and they've destroyed resistance in the process. And that's why socialism is more dangerous than communism. Our country is being socialized. Right? We're here, we've gathered here to register a very emphatic no to that on a general sense and to all of the specifics as well. But I've heard people say, well, at least they're only socialists, they're not communists. Wait a minute, wait a minute. Back up a minute and think about what you just said. Right? Conclusion number 3 then is what? Get us out. Is there any alternative to that? No. So I think we're a little bit guilty at JBS headquarters for letting the subject of the UN kind of slide. We're bringing it back. And one of the main ways of bringing it back is with the Agenda 21 fight, which has already been a success in a couple of communities, where a couple of communities, Carroll County in Maryland and Edmond, Oklahoma, have taken they've gone to the UN's Agenda 21 people. It's the ICLEI, ICLEI they call it, right? And they've invited them out of the community, right? So long, you're done, get out of here. So HR 1146, Ron Paul's introduced it. He's done it every year for the last maybe, 10, 12 years anyhow. The American Sovereignty Restoration Act. It's a measure sponsored by Ron Paul to provide for the complete withdrawal of the United States from the UN. If your congressman hasn't been a co-sponsor, bug him about that and make sure that he starts to be a co-sponsor of this bill. And it's so important, right? And then, of course, who's behind all of this is the John Birch Society. And the only recourse is to get us out. Thank you very much.